Some authoritarian regimes enjoy genuine popular support because of the charisma of their leader, the appeal of their programmatic agenda, and or their performance, for instance, in restoring law and order or distributing goods and services. Authoritarian populist regimes cultivated support in these ways, as was the case under Nasser, Vargas, and Perón. At the same time, political alienation can surface in democratic settings. Rather than conceptualizing political alienation as a function of regime type, I contend that it is rooted in perceptions of political exclusion. Moreover, I propose that whether citizens feel excluded depends on their perception of the following three aspects of the formal political system: whether the existing leaders and institutions represent them, they share and promote their values, interests, and objectives, whether the system is efficacious and has the capacity to translate their values, interests, or objectives into desired outcomes, whether the system is open to change. Those in power are accountable to the electorate and can be replaced through peaceful means. In sum, citizens' orientation to formal political order depends on whether and to what degree they perceive it as representative, efficacious, and accountable. Of course, the relative importance of each factor varies for different groups and individuals. Nevertheless, we can hypothesize that alienation is greatest when citizens perceive their political system as deficient in all three categories. How does an authoritarian regime's movement toward political liberalization affect aggregate levels of political alienation? To the extent that a shift to multi-partyism strengthens citizens' perceptions of the country's political elites and institutions as representative, efficacious, and accountable, we would expect it to reduce political alienation. But the formal shift to multi-party system does not necessarily engender such changes. If the parties of the new system are viewed as unwilling or unable to represent the interests and values of societal groups, levels of alienation may not decline. Similarly, if political contestation remains circumscribed, the shift to a multi-party system may not enhance the perceived accountability of the country's most senior power holders. Indeed, it's possible that the shift to a multi-party system could actually deepen political alienation if the new order were viewed as less efficacious and scarcely more representative or accountable than the one it replaced. Given the absence of public opinion survey data, we cannot compare levels of alienation among different societal groups or different social groups in Egypt, or determine whether and how they have changed over time. Nevertheless, there's considerable impressionistic evidence of two trends. First, that levels of political alienation are particularly high among urban, educated youth, and second, that their alienation may have increased since the onset of political reform. The culture of political alienation. Pointing to the low voter turnout in parliamentary elections, the widespread cynicism toward politicians, and the lack of popular affiliation with established parties. Egyptian commentators have argued that Egyptian political culture is increasingly characterized by alienation, al-ikhtirab, defeatism, al-salbiya, and indifference, al-la mubala. Furthermore, although it is not confined to one segment of society, this culture of alienation appears to be most pronounced among the educated youth of Egypt's cities and provincial towns. When exactly the problem of alienation surfaced? And whether it has increased over time are matters of debate. Egyptian scholars and journalists have been writing about the phenomenon since at least the early 1980s. And after the assassination of President Sadat in 1981, a series of articles on the crisis of youth appeared in the Egyptian and wider Arab press. Several books on the subject were published, and the massive alienation of the younger generation became a focus of public discussion. Public debate on the causes and consequences of alienation escalated in the early 1990s in a context of growing concern about the flow of educated youth into militant Islamic groups. Despite widespread acknowledgement of the crisis of belonging affecting Egyptian youth, its precise boundaries are difficult to define. There are no nationwide opinion surveys on the subject, while several smaller scale surveys in the mid-1980s indicated that most university students did not participate in any kind of political activity whatsoever. They did not systematically explore the reasons for this abstention. The following discussion is based on a series of in-depth, open-ended interviews with 27 recent university graduates. All the graduates were residents of lower middle class or popular shabby neighborhoods in Cairo, and nearly all were male. In order to find out the graduates' political attitudes before their mobilization by opposition groups, my sample excluded any graduate who identified himself or herself or was identified by others as affiliated with a specific political group or trend. Although the graduates I interviewed were not representative in any statistical sense, there's no reason to believe they were atypical. Although I cannot be certain that the frequency with which the views expressed by those in the sample accurately reflect those in the broader graduate pool, it is probable that the spectrum of views represented indicates the range of opinion held by the graduate pool at large. My interviews with a sample of recent graduates found a general pattern of estrangement from formal political institutions and elites. At the same time, they revealed a pervasive skepticism concerning the possibility of systemic change and the utility of personal effort to promote it. Most graduates I interviewed were preoccupied with the struggle to earn a livelihood. Compared with earlier generations, they explained, their situation was far worse. The white-collar jobs for which they had been educated were scarce. The available jobs did not pay well, and the opportunities for temporary work in the Gulf had dried up. A large majority of respondents believed that neither the government nor any opposition party offered a solution to graduates in economic distress. When asked whether government leaders were aware of their problems, most respondents said yes. When asked to explain the government's inaction, however, responses varied. According to one strand of opinion, the problems facing Egypt were so great that no government, no matter how well intentioned, could resolve them. Our country has been exhausted by 4 wars, one graduate noted, or as another observed, the government is doing the most it can. Is there anything more it could do? No, there isn't. As long as the country is in debt, there is no solution. Similarly, another graduate asserted, no matter who took power, he wouldn't be able to solve the problems. By contrast, other respondents claimed the real problem was one of political will. According to this view, government leaders had failed to confront problems of educated youth because their priorities lay elsewhere. As one graduate put it, everyone works for his own interest only. No one cares about youth. Most graduates also viewed the country's legal opposition parties as either unwilling or unable to represent them. A majority of respondents said they felt no connection with political parties, had little information about party platforms and candidates, and doubted the utility of political participation. The comments of Samer, a recent economics graduate, are typical. Parties are just names in our country. I don't belong to a party, nor do any of my friends. Most young people aren't very interested in politics. Politics isn't for youth. It's for old people. In addition, some graduates claimed that people join parties only in pursuit of private ends. As Akram, an engineering graduate, explained, I don't have any affiliation. I feel people join parties for personal reasons, to benefit somehow. Belief in ideology was important before, like when the British were here and people felt patriotic. The graduates claimed that opposition party leaders were not seriously committed to solving the problems of youth. As one graduate maintained, words are nice, but there is no implementation. They need to collect votes, so they claim to be concerned about the problems of youth, but when they're in power, they don't do anything. Or as another graduate observed, the people within parties are too busy fighting one another. As to a solution to youth's problems, there isn't one. Mafish. A few graduates noted that even if the parties did come up with solutions, they lacked the means to implement them. As Shihab, a literature graduate, said, the parties don't have the power to do anything. They don't care. They don't try to find solutions. But even if they did have an idea, they would be unable to carry it out. The NDP controls Parliament and doesn't allow other parties to carry out their plans. According to many graduates, the greatest obstacle to positive change was the nature of the system, and Nizam itself. Some blame the nature of the state apparatus, particularly the bureaucratic red tape and inertia that undermine governmental performance. As one graduate noted, the government tries. It plans, but the plans don't get implemented. The main problem is certain individuals in the bureaucracy. They follow the routine. There's no flexibility. It's also a problem of coordination. The land reclamation schemes are a good example. The graduates go out there in the desert, and find out there isn't any water or electricity. The government promises to provide them, but it doesn't happen. Hence, many graduates stressed the state apparatus, Jihaz ad-Dawla, needed to be reformed before their problems could be addressed. In addition to the suffocating weight of bureaucratic routine, respondents claimed that individuals inside and outside the state hampered the implementation of solutions out of self-interest or indifference. Politics and bureaucrats were more worried about keeping their seats than about assuming responsibility for bold initiatives, and rich Egyptians were unwilling to invest their money in Egypt. As one graduate explained, the new cities are a good idea, but those who should be investing in them are parasites who focus on trade and imports and exports. They don't want to risk. They want a fast return and an assured profit. Most capitalists will not launch projects for youth because that opposes their own interests. They act not in national interest, but in their own selfish interest. Even when graduates could identify dedicated and energetic public officials, they insisted that the system muted their impact, as one graduate noted. Ismail Sabri Abdullah, for example, he is very smart. He looks out for the other people, not the government. But unfortunately, the decisions are made from above. The ministers know only how to criticize. The result is to stifle any new initiatives. Or as another graduate exclaimed, even if I had some good ideas, some solutions to the problems, and I told a minister or something, he wouldn't be convinced. And even if he was, he wouldn't implement it. Because it comes from someone underneath. It's a type of backwardness we have here. There's always talk that Egypt is progressing. Who are we advancing beyond? Only those who are even more backward, like those in the Gulf. In regard to the three components of regime legitimacy noted earlier, the graduates' critique of the political system extended beyond complaints about the government's performance or efficacy to encompass deficiencies in the system's representativeness and accountability. In response to open-ended questions about the country's political life, several graduates lamented the enormous gulf separating those at the apex of the political pyramid from those at its base. As one graduate asserted, there shouldn't be such a distance between those in power and the youth. Our views don't reach the leaders. We want to say, come a little closer. You should give us more importance. You shouldn't neglect us. When asked what advice he would offer to the government, another graduate replied, I would do as Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph in 7th century Arabia did. I'd see what people had. I'd see what problems people had. I wouldn't go to Zamalek, an affluent neighborhood in Cairo. I'd go to the Fern, the bread oven in popular neighborhoods, and see what they were selling. I go on a surprise visit. I go down to the streets and live an ordinary life and see what problems were and find whoever was doing something wrong and take him to account and throw him out. The most pervasive theme in the graduates' critique of the political order was the lack of accountability in all spheres of Egyptian life. The rich get richer from illicit means and no one stops them. Public figures exploit positions for private gain. Judges and policemen take bribes, and individuals get ahead through connections rather than through merit or hard work. The graduates repeatedly stressed that the system encouraged the rich and the powerful to behave with impunity, alleging that there are no principles, there's no conscience, or there is a crisis of morals. In this vein, they distinguish between dirty, corrupt, and clean, honest, upright behavior. When asked how society's problems could be solved, one graduate replied, The way people think has to be cleaned up. Further insight into this perceived crisis of morals can be gleaned from the graduate's commentary on someone many regarded as a striking exception to the rule, Ahmed Rushdie. The outpouring of graduate affection and respect for a former Minister of Interior is puzzling, to say the least. How did an official who once headed the ministry responsible for internal security become the object of such veneration? Ahmed Rushdie was the Minister of Interior for 2 years, from 1984 to 1986. Robert Springborg described his tenure. Although personally severe, Rushdie was a keen reformer who preferred dialogue with rather than intimidation of the opposition. Mubarak's only Ministry of Interior not to be implicated by prisoners testifying in the torture case of 1986, Rushdie vigorously directed his ministry's efforts to such mundane but important tasks as improving the traffic flow in Cairo, as well as to the important and politically sensitive matter of rounding up drug dealers. For these efforts, he earned a grudging admiration of the opposition and the enmity of various powerful forces and personages, not the least of them being his successor, Zaki Badr. Rushdie was forced to resign after the Central Security Forces riots of 1986. Nonetheless, through the early 1990s, he remained widely admired for both his personal qualities and his achievements in office. Indeed, graduates who had just finished excoriating all politicians, past and present, changed their tone when asked about Rushdie. Intrigued by this distinction, I began asking all graduates, as well as Egyptians more generally, including, as it turned out, many taxi drivers, their opinion of Rushdie. The responses were overwhelmingly favorable and emphasized certain themes. Rushdie was a devout Muslim and was honest, efficient, and clean. Moreover, he was tough on crime and fair in applying the law. As one taxi driver put it, during his period, there was a real order in the country. If you did something wrong, you paid a fine or got punished. It didn't matter if you were big or small, even the ministers would be punished. In his effort to relieve the traffic situation in Cairo, Rushdie chose to go into the streets to assess the problems firsthand rather than sitting comfortably behind a desk in his office. When asked what he thought of Rushdie, another taxi driver replied, "A great man." Why? When he ran the Interior Ministry, things went right. You didn't get arrested without just cause. And if you were doing something wrong, you paid for it. He would go into the streets, check on things, make sure things were going okay. Now, the young police officers, they sit in the station with their feet up, drinking tea. Ahmed Rushdie was different. He'd go down to the neighborhood police station dressed in a galabia and check to see if people were doing their jobs. Dressed in a galabia, just like a peasant from the countryside. The graduate surveyed emphasized the same attributes: Rushdie's efforts to improve the system in tangible ways, as well as his fairness, courage, and personal integrity. They also commended his willingness to mix with the people, to go into the streets, just as some had described the revered second caliph, Omar ibn al-Khattab. Finally, a few graduates mentioned Rushdie's respect for freedom of expression, praising him for dealing with the opposition through discussion rather than repression. Those graduates who admired Ahmed Rushdie viewed his removal in 1986 as an inevitable consequence of his efforts to reform the system. At Shah, he was thrown out, or Shaluh, they threw him out. Shalu, because he threatened the interests of senior ranking officials. Some graduates even suggested that the government had fabricated the Central Security Forces riots to embarrass him. As one concluded, it doesn't pay to be good. You have to be a criminal, harami, to maintain your seat. Although many graduates traced the problems of contemporary political life to a lack of principles. They did not necessarily believe the Islamic movement offered a better alternative. Most graduates identified themselves as observant Muslims, and some who did not claimed they intended to become more observant in the future. When asked who their role models were, aside from their parents, the most frequent answer was the Prophet Muhammad and the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, or the Salihin, the upright ones, that is, the exemplary leaders of the first Muslim community in the 7th century Arabia. Several graduates stressed that a return to religion would help resolve society's problems by encouraging a shift from self-interested behavior toward greater concern for the public good. As one graduate noted, in Islam, people would look out for one another. Now everyone looks out for himself. But when asked specifically what they thought of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamic trend in general, many graduates reacted with the same skepticism they directed toward other opposition groups. Some noted that the Islamists faced the same structural constraints as did other opposition groups, and thus, like them, can achieve only limited results. Others claimed that the Islamists have not presented any clear solutions, or that application of Islamic law would solve many problems but create other problems, like a more closed society with little room for opposition. Some graduates mentioned recent scandals involving the Islamic investment companies of Al Rayyan and Al Saad as evidence that the Islamists exploited religion for personal gain. More generally, one graduate said, the application of Islam would be good, but it would be far from private ends. Many people use Islam as a curtain behind which to achieve their own goals. In addition, many graduates were unfamiliar with the services provided by Islamists. When asked whether the Islamists helped young people find jobs and housing, some graduates expressed disbelief. As one replied, who told you that? They don't help youth. If they did, all the youth would be pouring into the Islamic associations. You wouldn't find any of them on the street. A minority of graduates were openly contemptuous of the Islamic trend. As one graduate noted, Islam is the solution. The words are nice, but the way they want to apply it is wrong. They use brainwashing, and they say, if you vote for us, we'll provide you with services. Or as another declared, the Islamic leaders can't provide a solution. What they offer is an escape to the past. In sum, the graduates I surveyed all believe that Egyptian society lacked a moral order in which principles of right and wrong regulated individual behavior. Interestingly, this is close to Durkheim's image of modern society as pervaded by anomie, normlessness, from the Greek anomia, lawlessness. As ironic as this first appears, graduates regarded public life under authoritarian rule as characterized not by too much order, but by too little, with the caveat, of course, that what was missing was an order based on public morality and law rather than coercion. The graduates' perception that Egyptian society was afflicted by moral chaos heightened their receptivity to the Islamist message. Indeed, as later chapters show, it was the Islamists' promise to enforce public accountability through the application of religious law, rather than, say, a more straightforward emphasis on jobs and other material benefits that resonated most powerfully in their outreach to educated youth. Alienation from the political order did not automatically lead to opposition activism. On the contrary, the dominant response of the graduates surveyed was not political protest, but political abstention. Yet abstention did not indicate apathy. Most of the graduates I interviewed expressed a great deal of interest in social and political affairs, although nearly all of them believed there was little hope of change. As one graduate put it, we can talk about what is the most appropriate form of government for Egypt, and we can say that Western-style democracy would be nice, But the problem is that none of these options is realistic. None will bring a result because of the crisis of morals. Anyone who reaches power will exploit it to the fullest extent. Most graduates thus saw little reason to participate in politics. Some stressed that the electoral process was artificial, both because election results were subject to falsification and because real power lay not with the parliament but with the president, who was not directly chosen by the electorate. When asked if he or the people or other people he knew voted in elections, one graduate laughed and replied, "No, definitely not. They're just for show. They are a way for people to forget about their own problems for a while, to take some time off from their own worries. As for the MP of our area, from our area, I've never seen him." Political participation was viewed not just as ineffectual, but also as dangerous. As one graduate noted, here we have emergency laws. If I make a commotion, I could affect my future. I could find myself in prison. I'd stay away from problems. Given the risks and the dubious payoff of political participation, most graduates saw themselves confined to the role of bystander. One graduate stated this view with particular poignancy. There's no solution. The government's projects are only words. Even if God gave me true insight and vision, the ability to see things clearly and speak clearly, no one would listen. And even if they did, no one would implement anything. There are a lot of nice words, but as for implementation, there's nothing. The parties have good ideas sometimes, but they can't do anything about them. They don't have the authority. I sometimes read the opposition newspapers. We read the papers and enjoy it. Sometimes I find they're saying things I felt inside and wanted to say. Other times they make me laugh. But then I close the paper and return to the same miserable life. And that's it. For most graduates, the sense of impotence was accompanied by less by rage than resignation. As one graduate concluded, "Forget us and the next generation. There's nothing that can be done for us. Think about the little ones." A major indicator of political participation in a multi-party system is the rate of voter turnout in parliamentary elections. As further evidence of the dominant pattern of abstention, let us examine voter turnout rates during the first decade of Mubarak's rule.